All right, everyone, get ready. We're diving headfirst into Gemini Apps today. You know those AI tools everyone's buzzing about? We're cutting through the hype to uncover the real deal about your privacy. And no need to wrestle with Google's legal lingo. We've already done the heavy lifting for you.
We're going straight to the source. Google's Gemini Apps Privacy Hub, especially their notice and FAQs. It's your express lane to understanding how Gemini handles your data.
Exactly. And we're focusing on how it works for everyday users like you and me, not for some big company project. So no need to worry if you haven't mastered all the technical jargon.
We've got you covered.
First things first, when you're using Gemini, what's it actually collecting about you?
Google's pretty upfront about this. Gemini's keeping track of your conversations. That means anything you type in, any questions you ask, it's all being recorded.
Okay, so it's listening in.
In a way, yeah. They're also tracking how you're using the app itself, what features are you using, how often, things like that.
So it's learning your habits, huh?
Exactly. Kind of like how Spotify figures out your music taste.
But what about my location? Is it tracking my every move like some kind of digital detective?
It does use location data, but the level of detail, well, that really depends on what you've got set up in your overall Google account. It's like a sliding scale.
Yeah.
You might have location tracking on for everything, or just basic info, or even turned off completely. Gemini basically just uses whatever settings you've already got in place.
So it's not just Gemini making decisions about my data, it's connected to my broader Google world.
Right.
Makes sense. But the big question is, why collect all this info in the first place? What's Google doing with it?
That's where things get interesting. Google says they're using your data to make Gemini itself even better. More accurate responses, developing new features, that kind of thing. They're also using it for this thing called machine learning.
Machine learning. Sounds pretty intense. What's that all about?
Basically, it's all about teaching computers to learn and make decisions like we do. It's a huge deal for companies like Google, and your data is like this key ingredient in making those AI systems smarter over time.
Got it. So the more we use it, the more it learns.
Right.
Makes sense. But hold on a second. What about those times when you really need to have a private conversation, something you wouldn't want just anyone listening in on?
You're right to be thinking about that, and Google addresses it head on. They use this process called de-identification, especially when human reviewers are involved.
De-identification. Okay, now you have to explain that one.
It basically means they try to strip away any info that could directly identify you. Think of it like this. Imagine someone taking your conversation, your actual words, and removing your name, any specific locations, basically anything that screams, hey, this is your name.
Interesting. So they're at least making an effort to keep things anonymous. But if they're using all this data to train their AI, even without my name on it, doesn't that still feel a little, well, strange?
That's a totally valid point, and it brings up something really important. Google, even while they're explaining this whole process, clearly says that you shouldn't be relying on Gemini for anything truly confidential. They actually say, and this is a quote, "Please don't enter confidential information in your conversations or any data you wouldn't want a reviewer to see."
So it's like they're trying to protect your privacy on one hand, but on the other, they're saying, don't get too comfortable.
Right. It's like they're acknowledging that even with these safeguards in place, there's still a level of risk involved. And it's not just about protecting your identity at that moment, but also about how your data, even without your name on it, might be used to improve other products they offer. Things like those really complex tools they have on Google Cloud, for example.
Wow. Even without my name attached, it's all feeding into this giant Google ecosystem. That's definitely something to consider. Okay, let's say I'm feeling a little uneasy about all this data collection. What can I actually do about it? What control do I have as a user?
This is where your Google account settings come into play. Specifically, there's a section called Gemini Apps Activity. Now, here's the thing. By default, this setting is on for adults, meaning Google's keeping a running tab on your Gemini chats.
Hold on, collecting by default. Seems a little sneaky to me, like they're assuming you're okay with it unless you go digging through settings to turn it off.
You're not the only one who feels that way. It's becoming pretty standard, which is exactly why it's so important to be aware of it. But the good news is you do have choices.
Okay, good. Let's talk choices. How much control do I really have here?
Within Gemini Apps Activity, you can choose how long you want them to store your data. You've got options: 3 months, 18 months, or 36 months. And of course, you can always hit that delete button and wipe your conversation history clean.
All right, so some flexibility there. But here's a thought. Let's say I do a full sweep. Delete everything. Does that mean it's really gone? Vanish into the digital abyss? Or are we talking about digital breadcrumbs here?
You know, it's funny you should mention digital breadcrumbs because deleting your chat history in Gemini isn't quite as simple as it might seem.
That's right. It's easy to forget about those human reviewers we talked about.
Oh, right.
Even if you hit delete on all those conversations, if those reviewers have already seen it, analyzed it.
It's not really gone.
Yeah, that data, it's not just disappearing.
So even if I clear my history, there's still a copy floating around somewhere. Feels a little misleading.
It is a nuanced point, and Google does try to explain it in their documentation. That data used for human review is stored separately, and they can keep it for up to 3 years. 3 years. Okay, that's good to know. Deleting doesn't quite mean what we might think it means in this case. Speaking of sensitive info and data being used, we haven't even gotten to location data yet. That always feels like a big one for privacy.
For a good reason. Location data is a hot topic. It's incredibly valuable for tech companies, adds so much context to our digital lives,
Absolutely.
And Gemini is no exception.
So how does it actually work with Gemini? If I'm using it, what are they using my location for?
So Google outlines a few different ways. The most obvious one is to give you those spot-on responses to your requests, right?
Sure.
Like if you're asking for directions or recommendations, Gemini needs to know where you are to be helpful.
Makes sense. Showing me the best tacos in town doesn't help if it's showing me places halfway across the world.
Precisely. But it goes beyond those direct requests, too. Location data also helps Gemini understand your context, in a broader sense.
Oh, interesting.
Think about asking, what events are happening this weekend? Well, knowing your location means Gemini can show you what's happening near you, not just a random list from who knows where.
So even if I don't specifically say near me, it's kind of using my location to give me more personalized, relevant results.
Yes. Exactly. It's all about that seamless, personalized experience. And this is important. The level of location data that Gemini can access, it all goes back to those broader Google account settings we were talking about.
Right. So if I'm really cautious about location tracking, I need to make sure those settings are how I want them across the board, not just within Gemini itself.
Exactly. Think of those Google account settings as the main control panel for your data. Gemini is just one of the many services tapping into it.
That actually leads to another question. We've been talking about Gemini as this standalone app, but it can also be your main assistant on your phone, right?
Right.
Seems like that's where the data access would get, a bit more intense.
Absolutely. When Gemini becomes your primary assistant, its reach is much wider. Now, it's not just about answering your questions, it's managing different parts of your digital life.
Right. And to do that, it needs access to way more data. Things like your calls, your messages, even what you're looking at on your phone screen.
Right.
And I know it needs that access to be useful. But is Google being fully transparent about what it's accessing in those situations?
Well, that's where things get a little,
Murky.
Yeah. Google says this access is always in service of a better user experience, They're not just looking through your data for no reason.
Of course.
They need those permissions to actually do the things you're asking them to do.
Right. Like if I tell Gemini to text my friend John, it needs access to my contacts and my messaging apps to make it happen.
Exactly.
No different from using like Siri or Alexa in that sense.
Right. And it's not just those individual actions like sending a text. Let's say you're looking at a recipe on your phone and want to add those ingredients to your shopping list, but you do it through Gemini. Well, it needs to see what's on your screen to do that properly.
Okay, those are really helpful examples. It seems like the key takeaway is just being aware of those moments where granting that access, it makes sense for the functionality that you want.
It's all about finding that balance, convenience versus privacy. And that's where really understanding the connection between your Google Assistant settings and your specific Gemini settings is key.
That could get confusing. If I've already spent time customizing things in my Google Assistant settings, do those automatically apply to Gemini? Or is it treated separately?
That is a great question. And unfortunately, the answer isn't always clear-cut. It can really depend on the specific feature and how closely it's connected between the two.
So a little research and not making assumptions is probably a good idea for anyone really concerned about their privacy.
100%. Taking a few minutes to understand how your data is being used can go a really long way.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on, I wanted to circle back to those gems that Google keeps mentioning. They're pushing them these cool extra features within Gemini. But what do we know about data privacy when it comes to those? Are we back to square one? It's like every time something new and shiny pops up, we're right back to this whole data privacy thing again, right?
Right.
So are these gems treated differently when it comes to data? Or is it the same story, different package?
You know, it's interesting. Based on what we're seeing in Google's own documentation, it seems like even though they're pushing these gems as these separate cool features, they actually fall under the same data practices as the core Gemini experience.
So everything we've talked about, the data collection, the human reviewers, it all applies to those gems too.
That seems to be the case, yeah. Google's language suggests they're using data from these gems in the same way. To personalize your experience, improve those features, just like the core functions of Gemini. And remember, human review. That's a big part of how they're improving everything.
Okay, so it might feel like I'm jumping into a totally different part of the app, a whole different experience within Gemini, but that same data awareness is still key.
Exactly. Don't let the shiny new object distract you from the bigger picture. And it's a good reminder that this whole AI world, especially something as complex as Gemini, it's constantly evolving.
That's true. Every time I turn around, there's a new update or new feature. But Google actually emphasizes that new and evolving thing a lot in their documentation. It's not just a throwaway line.
Right, and I think that's really important for people to get. What we're seeing with Gemini today, even in terms of data, might be totally different a year from now.
So we're all basically beta testers. It's kind of exciting, but also a little, I don't know.
Unsettling.
Yeah. Like, are we ever going to know what the rules are?
It's a great way to put it, and that's exactly why staying informed, staying engaged, it's so important. Google even admits that Gemini, as advanced as it is, it's not perfect. They're upfront about the fact that it can make mistakes, give wrong information, even say things that are offensive.
Okay, so we're not ready to hand over control just yet.
Not quite. And that's actually where user feedback is so important. Google needs us to tell them when Gemini gets things wrong. Our feedback is literally part of what trains the AI and makes it better for everyone.
So it's a two-way street then. We're not just passive users. We actually have a role in shaping how this all develops. That's kind of empowering when you think about it. But with all that in mind, as we wrap up our deep dive here, what are your big takeaways? What do you really want our listeners to remember about Gemini and their privacy?
Honestly, I think the most important thing is to remember that Gemini is a tool. It's powerful, has a lot of potential, but like any tool, you got to use it responsibly, right? And with your eyes open. And that all starts with understanding what it's doing with your data.
Right. We can't just assume these tech companies have it all figured out,
Right.
or that they always have our best interests at heart.
Exactly. We have to be informed and proactive.
Be our own best advocates.
Yes. And on a practical level, that means a few things. First, and I know we've said it before, but it's worth repeating, check your settings. Don't just go with the defaults. Take a few minutes. Really look at your Google account settings, your specific Gemini settings, and understand what's being collected, what controls you have.
It's like actually reading those terms and conditions for once, right?
Exactly. This might seem obvious, but be mindful of what you share. Remember, there's a human review element to this whole thing. If you wouldn't want someone else reading it or listening to it, maybe don't share it with Gemini.
Especially knowing that deleting your chat history doesn't mean it's gone forever.
Exactly. And lastly, don't be afraid to use those feedback tools. If something seems off, whether it's wrong information or just feels creepy or offensive, tell Google. Your feedback is valuable. It's helping them train this thing.
It's like we're all part of this grand experiment, right?
Yeah.
The future of AI is still being written. It's not some predetermined thing. It's something we're all actively shaping through the choices we make and the feedback we give.
That's a great way to put it. The more informed and engaged we are as users, the better we'll be able to navigate this whole world of AI as it keeps changing.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it. Another deep dive in the books. We've gone from zero to well-informed on Gemini Apps privacy. And remember, folks, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those questions. Until next time, happy Gemini.